Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to day 13 of the December 2023 Advent Calendar. Today's subject is time, effort, risk and reward. So why am I doing a video about this? Well, we're often told that without risk there is no reward. And to an extent that is true, although the financial markets might disagree, especially at the moment. You can take little to no risk and invest in UK gilts, for example, where you lend money to the government. And at the moment, if you're looking at short-term gilts, you're getting a return of about 5% per year. So that sounds to me like no risk and quite a bit of return, especially in the short term. The government is very, very unlikely to default on those loans. So it's not exactly true, but there's a much more important nuance that we need to get into here. And that nuance is that just because there's risk there doesn't mean there's fair and proportionate reward. And it's not the way to look at the world. What we need to look at, and one of the reasons I got into property in the first place, was so that I could take low levels of risk, but still get reasonable to high levels of return. Now, that shouldn't be possible, according to some of the textbooks, but that's because they don't take into account how much effort is needed to get involved in direct property investment. So in indirect investment, which I would characterize as stocks and shares, for example, where you're not going to run a company, you're not going to be, unless you've got a huge shareholding, you're not going to be an active shareholder or an activist shareholder, as the term has been popularized in the last sort of 15 years. You're going to sit back and you're hopefully going to enjoy dividends, ideally every year, ideally growing every year, with an element of the share price growing. Now, anyone who's ever invested in stocks and shares will tell you that's not really the case. And actually, there's a little bit of volatility there, which is important. Share prices go up and down. And what we don't want to do is buy high and sell low. What we do want to do is buy low and sell high. But we might just buy low and enjoy the rewards, ideally forever, if it's a company that's going to carry on producing dividends for so long. And of course, that's one of the philosophies of the great Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, one of the greatest investment companies in the history of investment companies. But we can change this by putting effort in, as I say. So if we can sit back and enjoy returns of, say, 6 to 8% per year, and that's an average over many, many decades from the UK FTSE or from UK real estate investment trusts, if we want to limit this to property investment, someone else is going to run the fund, someone else is going to collect the rents, someone else is going to make the purchasing and disposal decisions, someone else is going to do the overall management of the property and the asset management. All we've got to do is decide what to do with the money. Now, if we're therefore going to put direct effort in, it stands to reason we're going to want a lot better return than 6 to 8%. But also we've got to bear in mind how much more risk are we taking on board in order to achieve those returns. So what I've tried to achieve is returns that exceed the 20 to 25% category, and I found that to be a fair reward for my time and my effort that I've put in. And I've tried to keep the risks down. How have I kept the risks down? I've managed purchases well by keeping the purchase price that I pay down. That old adage, you make your money on the way in, has worked well for me. But I've also looked at things in terms of front loading the effort. So I've tried to put effort in at the front end of the lifespan of an asset. And don't get me wrong, that front end might be a couple of years, because hopefully I'm looking to hold the asset for 20, 30, 40 years, or even longer, because the asset ultimately is held by a company, and I might sell that company, or I might pass some of the shares in that company down to my descendants, or I might do all sorts of other things with it. So I'm front loading the effort, and then hopefully I'm getting into a steady state where I've got someone managing it and overseeing the performance of the asset. They're managing the asset, not just the property management and any tenancy management, but the asset itself as well. And they're going to make sure that perhaps there's a huge blow up in prices, as there was between 2020 and 2022. And we might consider selling that asset at what we feel might be a fairly false price at the time. Perhaps there's other things we're going to do with it, but that's the joy and also the danger of being actively involved in investment. But of course, there has to be that level of reward for being actively involved in that investment. Otherwise, what's the point? And of course, this also feeds into how much leverage do you use? Where do you get it from? What type of leverage is it? You know, the beauty of buying a house and having a tenant in place is that the financing is pretty easy to come by, especially when you've done one already and even more so when you're considered more of an experienced and portfolio landlord. As you grow, you start to lose options on that side because some lenders don't like people with more than 3 properties, 10 properties, 50 properties. I've seen all sorts of numbers thrown around, but in reality, there's a lot more safety in numbers there, because if you've got 1 property and let's say you rely on that property for your income and the rent is £5,000 a month, well, that's great. But what if it's void? What if there's a big problem with that property and you're liable to fix it? What if the tenant doesn't pay and they refuse to pay and you have a 6-month period or even a 12-month period where you've got no rent? That introduces a huge amount of risk. Whereas instead, if you've got 10 properties where we'll pay £500 a month, then if you've got 1 empty or if you've got 1 not paying, it's not ideal, but you've lowered the risk significantly. And this is where diversification within the same asset class can come into play. And there are strengths and weaknesses to both. And I'm going to talk about that further in a later video in this series. But that was time, effort, risk and reward. Hope you find it helpful.